Okay, welcome back. This is part two of the week two lecture. So, again, we kind of worked our way up to about the halfway mark. And when he's reunited with his fellow survivors, that's a pretty big deal for him. Again, he doesn't really belabor it, he does not spend a lot of time dramatizing the scene where he kind of reunites with these guys. But again, he's been alone by his own calculation for, many years. I think the editors tell us about 4.5 years that he's largely separated from his fellow survivors, but he does seem to have contact with this guy named Oviedo, not to be confused with the historian. Not to be confused with the historian named Oviedo, who often appears in the footnotes to sort of cross check the information related by Cabeza de Vaca, but another guy, a member of the expedition named Oviedo, who's remained behind on Mojado while Cabeza de Vaca is on the mainland. And he tries to get this guy to come over to the mainland. It doesn't work out. The guy can't swim. I think he stays on Mojado and probably dies there. But eventually, Cabeza de Vaca and these other three guys, they get together and they're really trying to escape some of the tribes there in coastal Texas that have frequently enslaved them. So you'll notice that Cabeza de Vaca is offering a lot of information about some of these different tribes, some of these different groups that they encounter both on Mojado and on the mainland. So he mentions the Diguanes, Cuevenes, and the Mariams. And the Mariams in particular are kind of warlike and hostile towards the Europeans, and I think it's often the Mariams who are enslaving not just Cabeza de Vaca, but also the other guys. Dorantes, Castillo, and Estevancio are also enslaved at various times, and then they're free at other times. It's a little unclear because, again, Cabeza de Vaca doesn't explain it maybe quite as thoroughly as we would like, but we eventually get the feeling that they just want to get out of that area because it's too volatile, and they spend a lot of their time enslaved. So they start moving kind of to the south and to the west in the direction of what's called the prickly pear grounds or the prickly pear region. And those, prickly pears, obviously they can eat those. But they're trying to get away from this sort of Galveston Bay region where they've lived for years, like a number of years. So they depart southward together, this group of four that we've talked about. Cabeza de Vaca, Dorantes, Castillo, and Estevancio. And one thing that kind of changes also around this rough halfway mark is we sort of see a shift in narration. We see a shift in narrative style. So after sticking with mostly a linear first-person narration throughout most of the first half of the narrative, Cabeza de Vaca actually shifts to a weird sort of third-person technique, describing things that happen to other people, describing things that happen to Castillo and Dorantes and some of the other survivors. So he actually starts doing this around page 102. And it's just one of these weird moments in the narrative that you need to be able to sort of navigate. So if you're looking on page 102 in our edition, you'll notice this shift in narration because you have these little phrases in brackets, like Dorantes and Castillo told me. So he's sort of very subtly gesturing towards the fact that, okay, now I'm relating information secondhand. I'm relating things that I did not personally experience because, again, remember that he was separated from these guys for years. At one point, he's very sick. He's on the mainland. A bunch of these other guys go back to Mojado, but he has to stay behind because he's grown very ill. He eventually recovers, but he's separated from these guys for a long time. So he's relating some of their experiences. Again, just sharing information. That's the official role of this document. But it's a weird little section. It starts around page 101 or 102, and it runs until page 106. And the editors give us a nice, helpful footnote on page 106, that one really long footnote on that page. Near the bottom of the page, they tell us Cabeza de Vaca's narrative of Durantes and Castillo's account to him of their experiences subtly ends here, where you see the number 1 about halfway down the page of the actual narrative on page 106. So that's where he stops relating the experiences of these other guys. And as the editors say, it kind of gets subsumed by what comes next, sort of generalized ethnographic description. Again, describing Native Americans, but doing it in a much more thorough fashion compared to what we saw back on the peninsula of Florida. Not just describing what they look like, but describing what they eat, how they harvest it, how long it takes, offering a much more specific level of detail, because that's what he starts doing on Mojado. That's what he starts doing on the mainland of coastal Texas. He's observing. Again, his life kind of depends upon it. He has to learn certain things in order to stay alive. So the ethnographic details really do start to increase here. But the editors also tell us, okay, now it's like the spring of 1533. And I think that's when he and the other 3 guys start moving south towards the Prickly Pear grounds. Again, they're moving in the general direction of Panuco. I'm not sure how aware of that they are, but they are kind of going in the right direction. If they would just continue to kind of hug the coastline and keep pushing south, they would eventually hit Panuco, but nothing is that easy on this journey. Nothing is that straightforward. So to kind of jump ahead, by page 112, this is where I kind of marked it as the point at which they are the 4 of them are now kind of a unit, and they are fleeing down the coastline together, basically trying to get away from the Mariams and the other hostile tribes that have kind of menaced them and enslaved them over the last several years. They eventually come across a new group of Native Americans referred to as the Avivares, I think. They live in the Prickly Pear region, which is a little north of the Rio Grande River, which is sort of the dividing line between modern-day Texas and Mexico. So they eventually cross the Rio Grande and go into Mexico. But they live with the Avivares for a pretty long time, and they're treated very well. This is a very friendly tribe. They're not hostile. They're not warlike. So this is when we start to realize a lot of the cultural difference that Cabeza de Vaca does mention. So in coastal Texas, they were often living with these sort of semi-nomadic tribes that would travel according to food, their food sources and where they could find them. So they kind of did this seasonal travel. They didn't really have permanent homes. And they were often on the move. But as the survivors move further south and as they enter into Mexico, they encounter very different peoples. They eventually encounter much more organized, much bigger groups of people who live more settled existences. They farm. They eventually run into people who practice agriculture and have permanent settlements and live in towns. Again, a little bit more recognizable to the Europeans, a little bit more similar to what these guys would have been used to back in old Europe. So the Avivares aren't quite like that. They still are kind of wandering. They don't have a lot of food or a lot of resources, but they treat the survivors well. And Oviedo, our historian, not the guy back on Mojado who's probably dead by now, but the historian tells us that by this point, when they're living with the Avivares, they have complete freedom. They're really not confined or restricted in any way, but they're often naked and they're often suffering from a lack of food and exposure to the elements. So they're not exactly thriving, but they are being treated well. And this is also when they continue to practice healing. with the Avivares, I think, and they're kind of taken to it a little bit. They were resistant at first, as we saw in part 1. They were skeptical when they were first asked to perform as healers back on Mojado. They were saying, hey, we don't have the credentials. We didn't go to school for this. But for the Native Americans, that, of course, doesn't matter. They have different standards, different practices. But what we're going to see, and this is so interesting in the second half of the narrative, we're going to see how they practice healing and what they do. And again, an anthropologist might argue that this is kind of an example of cultural hybridity or transculturation. They eventually combine Native American medical practices, which we've already seen described. They kind of blow on the sick person, and the breath is designed to or the breath is thought to extract the illness. They continue to do that, but they add a little bit of their old world European culture to the mix. They start making the sign of the cross, which is, of course, a Catholic thing that the Native Americans had not previously experienced, and that becomes their healing style. Not only Cabeza de Vaca, but Castillo, Dorantes, and I think Estevancio as well. They all function as healers, and they all combine European medical practices with Native American medical practices, old world culture, and some of these cultures that they're encountering in the new world. So we can certainly observe that as the narrative continues. So yeah, they're moving south. Eventually they cross over into Mexico. And another important change that occurs is they alter their route a little bit. They are moving in the way of Panuco, but they eventually turn inland again. They eventually turn inland, largely to avoid some of these coastal tribes that are often semi-nomadic and warlike. They start to figure out that if they move a little inland, they encounter more peaceful people. They encounter people who are more likely to treat them as equals or to want them to serve as healers, because that might be some part of the Native American medical practice there or their religious practices. So the survivors start to realize, hey, we're better off a little bit away from the coastline. But ultimately that takes them away from Panuco, and that takes them on a very different sort of a different trajectory, which changes the nature of their journey and makes it a lot longer, as we will eventually see. Just another passage to mark on page 115. We sort of get a biblical reference here. We have a scene described by Cabeza de Vaca that's very reminiscent of the burning bush, which is described in the book of Exodus in the Bible. It's the location where Moses is appointed by God to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. So Cabeza de Vaca is not very literary, but this is kind of an illusion with an A, not like an illusion like something that's not real, but an illusion with an A, meaning a reference to something outside of the text. This is a very literary device. This is a sort of, many people would describe it as a type of figurative language, sort of referencing this well-known episode from the Bible. And remember his audience. I mean, this is a very Catholic, he's very Catholic. Spain was a Catholic nation by this point. So he's definitely, I think, doing it deliberately. He's using this kind of iconography, this imagery, this religious imagery that would have resonated with most of his readers. But we need to wonder, is he positioning himself as a Moses-type figure? Is he claiming to have been responsible for kind of leading his people out of the wilderness to kind of pursue that biblical parallel? Do we think he's doing that, or is he just using the burning bush to kind of make a useful comparison to this experience that he claims to have had when he was wandering alone in the desert of northern Mexico? So that's on page 115. You can think a little bit more about that. And from that point on, they continue to travel and they continue to encounter different groups. So they leave the Avivares, who are kind of poor, and they meet more prosperous tribes the further south and the further inland they go. And what begins to unfold over the ensuing pages is really fascinating. They become healers of some renown. They start out so skeptical and unsure, but in time, they become somewhat well known. All four of them become somewhat celebrated. And they kind of, like I said before, they kind of become celebrities. Like news of them precedes them wherever they go as they kind of make their trek across north central Mexico, and then they keep pushing west. They encounter all these different tribes who have heard of them, who have heard of these mysterious, foreign healers who are kind of traveling through the country, and people come to see them. People come to be healed by them. So a very interesting development and totally different from how they were living back on Mojado or in coastal Texas. So after they leave the Avivares, they realize that healing is kind of their ticket to the good life. And the Avivares kind of, based on what we see in the narrative, they seem to regard these guys as special, maybe divine. They call them the children of the sun. And again, historians kind of verify that, yes, certain Native American tribes, based on their cosmology, based on their religious beliefs, they might have viewed some of the early European explorers as maybe godlike or maybe sort of holy divinities, or maybe like soothsayers or people that had maybe somewhat mystical abilities, but other tribes probably regarded white people as evil or, bad, monstrous in some ways, and others might have just really not known, had no real, no real pre-existing model to really judge. So it varied, from culture to culture, from tribe to tribe, but the Avivares seem to have a mentality or a religious practice that's at least somewhat similar to what they're going to encounter later in Mexico. So what we start to realize, a couple of interesting things here. As they enter into Mexico, we continue to get a lot of ethnographic details. And we started to get some back in coastal Texas, right? About the ritual weeping, how the natives treated their children, sort of, relationship ties, social organizations. So he started that when he was largely, a captive back in coastal Texas, but he's continuing to observe and to write down his observations, or I'm not sure if he was writing them as they went or if he was storing them up here and he wrote them all later, but he's definitely observing cultural practices, and he's noticing how different these tribes are compared to the tribes they met earlier back on the peninsula of Florida and throughout the Gulf Coast. He's noticing sort of different patterns of behavior, different structures, different attitudes towards them. And again, they're often regarded as perhaps gifted or supernatural healers. And instead of continuing to reject that, they embrace it. And it's just very interesting to wonder, do they start to believe it? We remember the skepticism that they had back on page 93 when they literally laughed at the idea of being able to heal people. But later on, and I can't remember what page this is on, but you guys will see it, Cabeza de Vaca at one point, I'm pretty certain, he claims to be the best healer of the four of them. He claims that he's kind of the star. Now, and I've always wondered, is he beginning to think that he really can heal people, or is he just the best at pretending? Is he just the best at kind of combining the new medical practices that he's learned from the Native Americans with some of his older traditions that he knew from Europe? On page 118, the editors are kind of talking about this a little bit in one of the footnotes. And they're using some like cultural anthropology to kind of work through some of this. They mention Levi Strauss, and they talk about, it's up for debate, like what exactly is happening here when these guys are operating as shamans or healers. But it's certainly possible to think that their success, and they mention that people think they're very good at this. The Native Americans that they encounter think that they are successful healers, but maybe that's just because of the way they are perceived. It's almost like a placebo. If you think a famous healer is coming to attend you, then maybe you're just going to feel better without them doing anything. It's just your own mind assuming that you're getting treatment from the best there is. Maybe you're just going to naturally feel better as a result because your mind is telling you that you're better. So it's hard to really know, and it's hard to know what they thought about it because we don't get a whole lot of access to the interiority of these guys. Every once in a while, Cabeza de Vaca will mention how he was feeling or what he was thinking, but he doesn't do that a whole lot, and we never really know much, if anything, about what Dorantes, Castillo, or Estevancio are thinking. But again, pay attention to the ethnographic details. Pay attention to the detailed and carefully constructed catalog of all of these different nations and languages that they encounter as they cross through this sort of U.S.-Mexico border region and then into Mexico. So he tosses in a lot of quick notes about where things are located spatially, the alliances and wars, between different groups, what they smoke, what they drink, different details of their social organizations, and that continues really throughout the rest of the narrative. And as they become healers of some renown, we notice a very interesting cultural practice that I don't think Cabeza de Vaca really ever understands fully, but he describes it to us. So basically, they're traveling from village to village, and they'll often travel with large groups of Native Americans as well. And like I said before, news of their coming will often precede them. So before they even get to the next village, people are kind of waiting for them, like people kind of come to meet them, and people are lining up to be cured or healed. But while that's going on, the Native Americans who kind of introduce them to this new village, the people they're like traveling with, they go and basically steal a bunch of possessions from the village that they're currently visiting. So like whenever a new group gets healed, they almost have to give up a bunch of their possessions to the group of Native Americans who delivered the healers to them. It's almost like an arrangement, an agreement. So the natives accompanying the four men will steal a bunch of stuff, basically sack the villages. And the editors of our book refer to this as ritual pillaging and exchange. And we sort of get this described to us starting on page 135. And Cabeza de Vaca is very uncomfortable with this, and he tells his audience, namely the king, he tells us this. He says, I didn't really know what to make of this. And he says he and his fellow survivors were uncomfortable. They didn't like the idea of these new people who they were healing getting all of their stuff stolen from them. They can't really tell why it's happening or if it's like authorized. And Cabeza de Vaca does claim that the people introducing them, the people traveling with them, are kind of running a scam and basically are sort of using the healers and their reputations to gain a bunch of new possessions from these people looking to be healed. So we don't really know exactly what this is. We do notice that as one native group pillages another, the group that's being pillaged will then fall in with the healers and they'll go to the next village and then they'll pillage that village. So it almost seems like every group kind of gets their turn. And at one point, Cabeza de Vaca, I think he even sort of goes to some of these people who are being pillaged and he's like, hey, I'm sorry, like, I don't agree with this. I don't think you guys should have all of your stuff taken. And he's reassured by the people. They're like, oh, it's no problem. We're happy to give our stuff up for now because we're just going to go to the next village and take their stuff. So it's fine. And I'm paraphrasing here. And again, maybe Cabeza de Vaca is misunderstanding this. But certainly he does judge some of the people that he's traveling with. He claims that they are deceptive. He claims that maybe some of them, are not really being genuine with the whole healing stuff. They're just using it as a pretense to allow them to take stuff. But he doesn't seem 100% sure, and we are not 100% sure either because we just don't know enough about this practice. But the editors do talk about it. Again, they refer to it as ritual pillaging. And there is the suggestion that maybe this is normal in this part of the world. Like this is a practice that people are accustomed to. But the Europeans are not accustomed to it. So it's strange to them. And they sort of don't trust it. But they also don't really understand it, which might also be the case in many other points of time as well. So they don't quite know what's going on. The new groups of people are often kind of afraid of them, but also very happy to see them, happy to be healed. But again, sometimes the people they're traveling with will intentionally frighten new tribes and say, hey, if you don't do what these people will tell you, or if you don't do what we tell you, these guys can strike you dead. Or these guys can, do all kinds of bad things to you. And again, Cabeza de Vaca and his companions don't necessarily advocate for that. They don't always necessarily seem to approve of that. But again, they don't really feel like they can stop it. They don't really feel like they have the power to stop this ritual or this custom that seems pretty common in this area. But it's very mystifying to them. So it's all rather strange. And again, we certainly don't have to agree with all of his observations. We might think that he is getting certain things wrong, which is very likely, but we also know that he's grappling with these cultural practices that he observes. He's trying to understand. He is at least inquisitive, even if he doesn't always arrive at necessarily the right answer. Another instance of self-justification occurs around this same time in the narrative, and that's when they change their route. So I already mentioned this. They start to push inland instead of just continuing to push southward down the coast, and if they had continued to just do that, they would have eventually hit Panuco. But the editors seem to think that they largely changed their path because they were tired of getting sort of falling into conflict with some of the semi-nomadic coastal tribes. But Cabeza de Vaca seems to suggest that they actually heard that Native American groups further inland had more food and had more resources and kind of had better stuff, so they wanted to go and get with those people. So if you guys turn to 138 in our edition, this is one of the few instances where Cabeza de Vaca's account, this 1542 version that he wrote on his own, differs from Oviedo's history. And remember, Oviedo based his history on the joint account that Cabeza de Vaca wrote with Dorantes and Castillo not long after they were discovered by other Spaniards back in the 1530s. So we notice the discrepancy on 138 when Cabeza de Vaca claims, we heard rumors that if we turned inland, we would find houses and more prickly pears and flour. We would find people who maybe practice agriculture or whatever. And Oviedo does not say that in his history. So there is the suggestion here, the editors kind of suggest that possibly this is another example of Cabeza de Vaca sort of justifying what was mostly just a mistake, just a screw up on the part of the Europeans. But he's saying, no, we had a good reason for going inland. We weren't just trying to get away from mean natives. We were trying to get to people who had flour and, settled villages and, more food, more resources. Oviedo doesn't really corroborate that. So we can wonder what their real purpose was. Maybe they just got lost again. Maybe there wasn't really a reason. They just took a turn and they could never get back to their original track. I'm not really sure. But one way or another, they start going basically west as opposed to continuing south. And it takes them a long time, but they eventually cross the entire country of Mexico. And like I said, they end up near the Pacific coast by the time they finally encounter other Spaniards. Because remember, though Spain has conquered Mexico, they haven't populated the entire country. So northern Mexico, which is where these guys are, there's no Spaniards really up there yet. They've made it to Panuco, but that's on the coast. And they've made it pretty far up the Pacific coast. But in the middle, in this sort of north central region, which is kind of arid, a lot of it's desert, the Spaniards really haven't settled that area yet. So these guys are not encountering any other Spaniards. They're just traveling with Native Americans. And eventually they're traveling with like thousands of Native Americans. They have sort of a, they have a following. They've kind of brought converts in, and they have people who are traveling with them, following them, and helping to introduce them, like we said, to new villages and new tribes where they can practice their healing powers. So on 143, it's claimed that they have like 3,000 or 4,000 followers. Now, I don't know how precise those numbers are. I'm not sure how well Cabeza de Vaca and his companions could really count everybody up, but certainly their situation has changed, right? They've come a long way from Mojado, and they're now kind of important. They're kind of important people, and they're treated very well. They're sort of given first dibs on a lot of things. They're consulted. A lot of people want them to bless their food or their other possessions. So quite a turnaround, quite a change. I think Cabeza de Vaca even complains on 143 about some of the difficulties of being a celebrity. To me, as the narrative progresses, again, Cabeza de Vaca kind of becomes a little bit more modern. We might think of him when we first meet him as a conquistador from what was still not far removed from like feudal medieval Spain. Right? He's existing right at this dawn of modernity. And as he encounters all these new people, he's maybe becoming a little bit more modern himself, largely through this process of cultural hybridity, as different things are combining and melding. So eventually they meet the people of the cows, who have the first permanent settlements that they've encountered since they were near Appalachian, like around the Florida Panhandle, back, early in the expedition. So he talks about how these dwellings had the appearance of houses. I'm around 147 now, and he describes the people of the cows as having the most well-formed bodies we saw, the greatest vitality and capacity. And he talks about how they understood us and responded to what we asked them. So I'm not 100% clear on language, but it seems like they're running into a lot of groups now who might have mutually intelligible languages. Not always, because we also learned that Estevancio and sometimes maybe the other guys will sometimes have to maybe translate or sort of navigate different languages. But it does seem like these guys have learned at least some of the local languages and dialects, and they might be able to communicate with a pretty wide assortment of different peoples, different tribes. Again, many of these groups seem to have some degree of like kinship relationships. Like they might not necessarily be related, but they might share certain aspects of culture or language. They might have similar religious practices. Again, a lot of these people regard the four survivors in similar ways. So they might have a lot in common, which allows some of this travel, and it allows Cabeza de Vaca and the others to kind of go from one group to the next without really encountering a lot of conflict or violence. Unlike coastal Texas, where they encountered a lot of that, here things are much more peaceful. The people seem a little bit more prosperous. Certainly the people of the cows do. I think they're practicing agriculture. You know, they have settled homes. They have a pretty advanced society. So now the guys are in a very populous land, and their reputations continue, you know, to precede them. And then they hear about other people who might grow corn and might practice metalworking. So when they hear stuff like that, again, they're like, okay, those are more advanced societies. So again, but that might just be self-justification, because Cabeza de Vaca keeps saying, yeah, we heard about these really good people, these really affluent, successful people with a lot of good stuff, so we were trying to get to them. Maybe that's true, or maybe they were just lost, or maybe their path was really sort of dictated largely by the Native Americans they were traveling with. Right? We don't really know. Maybe the Native Americans were kind of, you know, maybe some of their followers who were engaging in this ritual pillaging, maybe they kind of set the course and said, okay, we're going to this place next, and then we're going to travel to this village, that village, we're going to visit these people, we're going to go and talk to these people. We don't know. This could be another example of Cabeza de Vaca trying to provide a good reason for why it took them so long to find other Spaniards in Mexico. But we also start to learn a little bit more about these other guys, not a ton, but the other survivors. We learn some interesting details about Estevancio in particular. If you look on page 153, and again, Cabeza de Vaca always refers to him as the black man, and he doesn't talk about him a lot, but he does mention on 153 that Estevancio serves oftentimes as an interpreter and a guide. And again, Cabeza de Vaca doesn't really expound on this, but it's an interesting observation. And we also learn, it's sort of implied that Estevancio might often go sort of ahead of the group, and he might take some Native Americans along with him, and he's kind of an advanced scout. He kind of goes and checks out the lay of the land, and maybe even spreads word to other groups that, hey, the healers are coming, get ready, they're going to be passing through town tomorrow, so be here, you know, get ready to have all of your stuff taken. So he's playing a very interesting role, considering that he started the expedition as a slave. He belongs to either Dorantes or Castillo. I'm not sure which. But he takes on a really important role, and we can maybe speculate as to some of the reasons why. He's used to adapting to new cultures. Remember, he's a Moroccan, most likely, who was probably a Muslim, captured by the Spanish, probably forced to convert to Catholicism. He has to learn Spanish. He has to learn how to adapt to Spanish society. And then he finds himself on this expedition going to the New World, where he's interacting with all kinds of different people. So he seems kind of uniquely positioned to do that kind of work. He seems very proficient with language. If he serves as an interpreter, that means he's learned multiple Native American languages, something that maybe the white guys don't really do. I'm not really clear on how proficient they are, but we know Estevancio is. So that's an interesting thing to know, and we'll return to him a little bit later as we get near the end. But, you know, they continue to push in the sort of general direction of the Pacific, and eventually they start to see more signs suggesting that they're getting closer to Spaniards. They start to see like helmets and other pieces of equipment that conquistadors would have carried with them. So they get the notion that they're getting closer and closer, and as they continue to push west, eventually they do encounter other Spaniards. I won't say too much about that here, because again, I know that a lot of us probably have not gotten to the end of the book, but I do just want to point out one interesting scene, which again, I think it says a lot about the four survivors, and it's also the kind of thing that's likely to appear in Cabeza de Vaca's account, the one that he wrote personally, but maybe less likely to have appeared in the joint account that he wrote earlier with Dorantes and Castillo. But on page 159, he's narrating this sort of fateful moment where they finally reconnect or finally find other Spaniards. So before this happens, they know they're getting closer. They know they're probably just like a day or two journey away from, finding more Spaniards. But on 159, we get a little bit more detail. So Cabeza de Vaca wants to sort of keep pushing and go ahead and just make the final trek to find the Spaniards, but he tells us that let me try to find this exact passage here. Yeah, on 159, he asks his two fellow white Christian Spaniards, who he obviously prizes more than Estevancio. He asked them to go with him. So about halfway down the page on 159, that night I entreated one of my companions, so I'm not sure who it was. He's not going to share the names. He doesn't want to impugn anybody's reputation, I guess. But he says, that night I entreated one of my companions to go after the Christians who were going through the area, trying to find the other Spaniards who were nearby. He's estimating at this point that it would be about a 3-day journey, but I think it turns out to maybe be a little less than that. But he goes on to say the they refers to either Castillo or Dorantes or maybe both of them. This they judged a troublesome undertaking, excusing themselves because of fatigue and hardship, and in spite of the fact that each one of them would be able to do it better than I, Cabeza de Vaca, on account of being hardier and younger. So he makes it a point not only to say that one of these guys, at least, refused to go with him because they were tired, but he also wants to make the point that they are younger than me, they are stronger than me, and they still didn't go. But you know who does go? Is Estevancio. He takes Estevancio and a bunch of Native Americans, like a dozen Native Americans, and that's the group that eventually finds the nearest encampment of Spaniards. But one thing we'll notice, and I think he pretty much says it in the narrative, the Spaniards that they find are literally slave traders. They are literally going through the countryside, grabbing Native Americans and forcing them into unpaid labor. They are literally enslaving all the able-bodied Native Americans that they can find. That's what they are doing in this northwestern region of Mexico. So Cabeza de Vaca sort of recognizes that, and he has some mixed emotions when he reconnects with Spaniards finally after this, 7-year journey. So I want you guys to really pay attention to what he's talking about at the end of the narrative, because he seems like he's pulled in multiple directions. He's not a big fan of the slave traders. He thinks that they're a little bit distasteful to him. And we even learn, I think maybe largely through the editors and maybe some of the footnotes, that he kind of I think he even says it himself, he kind of clashes with these other Spaniards, because the other Spaniards want to just enslave any Native American sort of indiscriminately. But of course, Cabeza de Vaca has been traveling with with a bunch of Native Americans. So he's sort of trying to defend his people And he's saying, no, I really don't think you need to do that to these people. These people practice agriculture. These people have a social structure that's somewhat similar to our own. These people like us and really value us in their society. We've been treated very well. We're considered to be healers. They're a very peaceful people. They want to get along with us. We don't need to use these brutal practices. So he disagrees with what the slavers are doing. And we hear some of these sort of harrowing tales of many of these Native Americans like taking to the hills, like abandoning their villages, trying to get away from these Spanish slaving expeditions. And Cabeza de Vaca is not really on board with that style of enslavement. But he doesn't have a problem with these Native Americans becoming Spanish subjects. So we have to navigate that distinction because it is kind of an important distinction. He might not want them to be forced into slavery, but he does claim that they should be under the control of the Spanish crown. And that's a position that many of us will probably not agree with. But around like 156, 157, he's really doing two different things. He's sort of cataloging and recording these horrific experiences that a lot of the Native Americans that he personally knew were experiencing at the hands of these slaving expeditions that were going through the area. But he's also sort of offering his own advice about how to best subdue and assimilate the local Native American population into sort of a Spanish colonial project. So, historically, a lot of critics and readers regarded Cabeza de Vaca as being somewhat progressive in his way, like at least compared to other conquistadors, having a more sort of nuanced, compassionate view of Native Americans. And yeah, that's fair. I mean, I think he did have that. But the reason a lot of modern readers increasingly reject him or at least don't view him in quite the same positive light is because he never repudiates the Spanish imperial mission. He does not have a problem with the idea of these Native Americans kind of losing their autonomy, essentially. He doesn't necessarily want them to be slaves like he was, like what he's seeing this slaving expedition do, but he does want them to, pledge their allegiance to the Spanish crown. He wants them to essentially work for the Spanish, but he thinks they can be sort of left alone to some extent. He largely makes the case that they would be willing to assimilate to Spanish culture, that they would be willing to work with the Spaniards, not in opposition to them, maybe even work for the Spaniards. But he's sort of pushing for humane treatment, and he's also making a lot of distinctions between different groups and different tribes. So the coastal tribes back in Texas, he has a very low opinion of them. He might not think that they would be fit to assimilate and sort of blend into Spanish culture. But the people that he's traveling with in Mexico, he has a higher opinion of them. He thinks they're more advanced. He thinks they have more advanced social structures. And largely for those reasons, he thinks that they could easily kind of join Spanish society. So you guys need to form your own opinions about what he's saying at the end. What do you agree with? What do you disagree with? And what is our ultimate sort of opinion of this guy? Do we believe that he had some kind of a change of heart in terms of how he views Native Americans or how he views the Spanish colonial project? Do we see him actually advocating for Native Americans by the end of the narrative? Do we actually think he's doing that? Does this become a story of transculturation? Do we see cultural hybridity? Do we see, for maybe even just a fleeting moment, Some critics have argued that, it never lasts. It never lasts in the Americas, at least not during this period of expansion and conquest. But we get these brief moments before everything becomes sort of systematized and finalized and codified. We see these brief moments, and we can see some of these later with English colonization as well, these brief moments where maybe social roles aren't totally defined, and we do have different cultures coming into contact with one another, and maybe it's not always violent, maybe it's not always oppositional. We do see real exchange. We do see real sharing. Maybe we see a glimpse of that in Mexico when they're, traveling with these big groups and practicing their healing. Maybe we do see it, but it gets dashed. Once they discover other Spaniards, once Cabeza de Vaca and Estevancio and those 11 or 12 natives find this Spanish slaving expedition, that brief, almost utopian moment kind of gets dashed. It gets driven asunder because the powers that be will never allow it. The Spanish in charge, they don't really want to listen to Cabeza de Vaca. He's, they think that he's kind of gone off the deep end. At first, as he points out, they don't even really recognize him as a Spaniard. They're not sure what he is. They're kind of mystified at his appearance, and they're mystified that he's still alive after these 7 years. People had probably written off the Narvaez expedition and just assumed that there were virtually no survivors. So he doesn't exactly have an easy time reintegrating into the colonial sort of Spanish presence in Mexico. So that's interesting to note. He butts heads with the Spaniards that he meets, but he's still championing, sort of a champion of this larger cause. He's still on the side of Spanish colonization. And part of what he's trying to do with this letter of relation, with this expedition narrative, is to kind of make the case to the king and a larger sort of official audience that, hey, there are a lot of people in Mexico that we can work with, that we can be peaceful with, that might be able to help us and work alongside of us. We don't have to treat them badly. We don't need to use force. We don't need to use violence. But our knowledge of history and what happened in the Americas, I think, tell us that Cabeza de Vaca's vision did not really win out. And a lot of what he's recommending did not happen. So let's figure out what we think about him and how does he figure into this larger colonial project that, as we know, was really just getting underway in the Americas, and it would continue for hundreds of years. The English would get in on it, and that's where a lot of our history in the U.S. comes from. So next week, we're going to check out, at least briefly, a little bit of John Smith's expedition narrative about New England. But our real focus next week is to read some Native American folktales. So we've seen how Cabeza de Vaca describes Native Americans and how he sort of provides some ethnography, talks about their customs and cultures. He even relates a story that some of the Native Americans tell that's going to be a little bit similar to the trickster tales that we read next week. So we're going to dig a lot deeper into the indigenous literary practices that were already very much in existence and operational before Europeans ever landed in the Americas. We're going to do that before we sort of continue our tour of exploration and conquest and the establishment of what we might think of as a U.S. literature. We'll kind of get into that more beginning in week 4. But just to see another example of an expedition narrative, we'll check out at least a few chapters from John Smith next week, and we'll also tackle those Native American folktales. So try to finish Cabeza de Vaca by the end of week 2. If you're still wrapping it up early in week 3, that's okay, because the reading load in week 3 is a little bit lighter. Okay? So get in touch with me if you have any questions or concerns, and I will see you guys next week.